Hi there, U.S. history students. So I have a little bit of material I want to present to you from lesson 8.2 here in this flip video. Again, I'm sorry I can't be with you in school on Friday. I'll be at the funeral for my friend Niles. If you could think to pray for his family today, that would be appreciated. Anyway, let's jump in. So you guys either have already or you will watch an excerpt from the war documentary where you're going to see a picture of the world or Europe and Asia kind of going to hell in a handbasket, like the situation getting really ugly. And what I want to cover for just a moment, a key idea here from lesson 8.2 is how Americans responded to this as they watched it happen in the late 1930s. And if you can summarize quickly, it's just Americans felt like, whoa, let's not touch this guy with a 10-foot pole, right? Like, this is a screwed up situation. Let's just stay out of it as much as we possibly can. FDR has a different approach, different thought process on this than most Americans. He's much more inclined to get involved. However, he is far too good a politician to think that, you know, a position on like, let's jump in on this war that's happening in Europe and Asia, that's a winning position for him. It is not. He clearly understood this, and he did not want to get too far out ahead of the public. And so he's kind of careful to couch his words on this. He's more vocal with regard to Japan invading China. And look, that was barbaric. That was there was just catastrophic numbers of civilian deaths. And Japan was acting sort of with extreme prejudice as it moved through China. But it's funny, even when FDR there was saying basically, hey, this is not how civilized countries behave. You know, we're going to stop trading with you, Japan. There was isolationist-minded Americans who were saying, what are you doing? You just need to be quiet about this, right? Like, if you start talking tough and acting tough on this, then Japan's going to turn and be like, what's your problem? And then we're going to get drawn into this. Just knock it off. And so, you know, isolationist-minded Americans, you know, the criticism of them was that they were a little bit, see no evil, hear no evil. They just don't want to know about it. That's not entirely wrong. Americans didn't really want to know about it. They definitely didn't want to get involved. FDR is sort of like wanting to do more, but recognizing politically there's just no way I can do this. Congress passes, you know, just consistently, I write here, 34, 35, 37, and 39, these neutrality acts. And these neutrality acts say the United States is not getting involved in this conflict in Asia or in Europe, and we're not going to be cutting off trade or doing all this other stuff either. Like, we are not getting involved. And that is primarily Republican Congresses. Republicans were the more isolationist of the two parties, but frankly, isolationism was a pretty bipartisan deal in the 1930s. As the situation got crazier and crazier and the stakes got higher and higher, especially once like we're at the Battle of Britain stage, then it's going to be really hard for Americans just to say, we need to totally stay out of this thing. There was an organization called America First in the 1930s. And the America First movement was a neutrality or an isolationist movement saying Europe's problems are not our problems. Asia's problems are not our problems. We need to stay a mile away from this thing. We learned some lessons in World War I, right? We ended up kind of getting carried away and getting involved, and we regret it. The spokesperson for the America First movement, of all people, is Charles Lindbergh, right? The great celebrity and hero from the 1920s, now a man in his maybe my age. He would sort of go and give these speeches basically encouraging Americans, like, we need to stay out of this conflict. And staying out of it means like suppressing the urge to condemn what Germany's doing, suppressing the urge to condemn what Italy and Japan are doing. Let's give Lindbergh our ear here. He said, we must band together to prevent the loss of more American lives in these internal struggles of Europe. Modern war with all its consequences is too tragic and too devastating to be approached from anything but a purely American standpoint. We should never enter a war unless it is absolutely essential to the future welfare of our nation. Our safety does not lie in fighting European wars. It lies in our own internal strength, in the character of the American people and institutions. We won't make ourselves safer by getting involved there. We will make ourselves safer by refusing to touch it and refusing to get involved. We don't have an issue with the Nazis. We don't have an issue with Japan. Roosevelt began increasingly to speak out, or speak in language that, again, we're going to see it's a little bit veiled, but he's saying ignoring this is not going to make it go away, friends. Let's read Roosevelt. When an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins in a quarantine of the patients in order to protect the health of the community against the spread of the disease. War is a contagion, whether it be declared or undeclared. It can engulf states and peoples remote from the original scene of hostilities. We are determined to keep out of war, yet we cannot insure ourselves against the disastrous effects of war and the dangers of involvement. By closing our eyes and plugging our ears, we are not making ourselves safe. All right, the contagion is loose and it is growing and is expanding. We need a more robust approach, says FDR, to make ourselves safe. Some of the America First movement, or some of the anti-war movement, was just flat out, not even like, Lindbergh represents, I guess, what you could call a good faith, like, let's not get involved in this, it's not in our interest. But there's just flat out Nazi sympathizers, and a lot of them in the United States, like a weirdly disturbing amount. 20,000 of them gathered in Madison Square Garden, there in New York City. They called it a pro-America rally to kind of, throw the scent off. But it was like replete with Nazi flags and Nazi images, and basically saying, stay out of the war, stop, getting so agitated about all this anti-Germany stuff. And after all, the Jews are a problem, right? It was sort of like this weird thing where it's sort of like as the speeches went on, the anti-Semitic themes emerged. Or then like the anti-Roosevelt themes emerged, or people start saying it's not the New Deal, it's the Jew deal. There were 2 such rallies. It's disturbing to me that anything like this ever took place, but there was enough sympathy in the days before America had declared war where people were like, just sort of flat out Nazi sympathizers. In the aftermath of the war and the Holocaust, this had become something that people would be eager to forget and sort of renounce that they were ever a part of, but it did happen in a very strange way. So what was happening in the war? Well, what was happening in the war is that it was going really poorly for the Allies. France had fallen, which we covered and which you'll see in your video. The only ally left standing now is Great Britain. Winston Churchill, one of the greatest things Winston Churchill ever did was just forbid anyone in the British government from even considering the idea of like listening to peace negotiations with Hitler. Hitler would have been happy to offer generous peace terms with Britain and end that war so that he could just sort of fight Russia without having to deal with Great Britain. And Churchill said, "We are not doing this. We're going to fight on to the end." I put a quote from his spectacularly wonderful speech and very famous speech. And this speech was given, you have to know, the speech was given at the darkest moment, right? They had escaped at Dunkirk, by the skin of their teeth. They're in terrible shape. And Churchill just says, we are not giving in to this guy. We are never going to surrender, and we're going to fight to the end. The Battle of Britain is interesting. The Nazis do not attempt an amphibious invasion, a sort of an invasion where they try to go from the English Channel onto land, because it's so extraordinarily difficult to do, as we'll find out with D-Day. So they try, air warfare at the level that they had it now was a new mode of war, and Hitler says, well, let's try to just sort of bomb them into submission. And so London and other civilian targets and everywhere else are bombed to smithereens. And the RAF, the Royal Air Force, is having it out over the skies of Great Britain in 1940. And Hitler, grows tired of this. It's like he sort of like loses focus. It's like he has an ADHD moment or something like that. And he just sort of says, this is taking too long. This is too frustrating. This isn't happening. And he makes his most calamitous mistake. Hitler does. He decides late summer to announce an invasion or to present to his generals a plan to invade Russia. He opens up a war on the Eastern Front while he hasn't yet dealt with Great Britain. This will be his fatal mistake. So the new situation in 1941 now is that the Soviet Union has entered the picture. And it has entered the picture on the side of the Allies. The Allies had been Great Britain standing alone. Now the Russians have joined with them. The United States remains stubbornly on the sidelines. And one of the turning points of this war is in that invasion of Russia. And this is a whole like huge story in and of itself. And I'm going to unfortunately just have to not give it the full credit that it deserves. But in that invasion, the fighting lasts for several years, and the basic story is this: like the first half of it is like spectacular Nazi successes as they move through Russia. Russia is not ready to fight. Stalin has like killed off most of his officer class during like the Red Terror stage. This is like a catastrophic mistake by him. The German Blitzkrieg is working as well in Russia as it had in France. And as they're nearing major cities like Moscow and Stalingrad, they get bogged down. They get bogged down in cold weather. They get bogged down in the snow. They get bogged down as the Russians are sort of gathering themselves and beginning to push back. And this is the first set of defeats that the Nazis experience, military defeats that the Nazis experience. And it has little to do with Britain or the United States. This is just the Soviet Union finally like absorbing this blow and beginning to push back against Nazi Germany. And that pushback from the East would continue all the way to 1945. And they had to do it on their own, and they suffered terribly at the cost of 30 million dead in Russia. It's a number we just cannot fathom. And it's the perpetual debt that the world will owe to the Soviet. The greatest thing the Soviet Union ever did was pushing back the Nazis and like gaining the upper hand on the Eastern Front. The war has a lot left to go, and we're going to find that out. But like that's a key moment. Okay, so next week there will be more. There'll be more for you guys to get done on your in-class worksheet. But thank you so much for listening. Thank you, second hour and sixth hour, for your patience with me. And I'm sorry I could not be there today. But bless you and have a wonderful weekend. See you guys.